Well, welcome to the fourth and final session of this year's Brown Bagger webinar series, where the series is focused on updates on tools and strategies to genetically improve beef cattle. And today we really have an international focus, the benefits of international collaborations with really three speakers. Andrew Cromie from the Irish Cattle Breeding Federation, Darrh Bullock, whom you know well from the University of Kentucky, and Kajal Devani from Canadian Angus. So again, this is the National Beef Cattle Evaluation Consortium's Brown Bagger webinar series, the fourth session this year. I'm your host, Matt Spangler. I'm at the University of Nebraska, and this webinar series is brought to you with a partnership with two close colleagues, Bob Weber from Kansas State and Darrh Bullock from the University of Kentucky. If you've not already done so, I encourage you to visit our website, nbcec.org, where we'll house recordings of this year's session, and you can also find recordings of previous year's Brown Bagger webinars, and you can also find the third edition of our sire selection manual. So I'll go ahead and introduce the first speaker today, Dr. Andrew Cromie, who's going to visit with us about building an international wiki on data collection and genetic evaluations. Andrew comes from a beef and dairy background and is currently the technical director for the Irish Cattle Breeders Federation and is responsible for delivery of services to the Irish cattle breeding industry. He's a graduate of QUB in Belfast, also of Edinburgh and the University College of Dublin. He also holds an MBA from the University College at Cork. He's the current chairperson for Interbeef, and his work at the current time is really focused on the role of genomics in addressing Ireland's greenhouse gas emissions mitigation requirement, and as a part of that, promoting the integration of beef and dairy systems there in Ireland. So really pleased to have Andrew join with us today. And I know he's got a lot of exciting ideas around collaboration and what they're doing more generally in Ireland and more broadly in other parts of the world. And so with that, I will first mute myself, Andrew, and then I will turn it over to you.
Excellent, Matt. And thanks very much for the kind invitation to speak with the group this evening. I'm just going to, in terms of, you can control, okay. It should have worked now. Yes, I have the control now. Thanks, Matt. Okay. Binder options, yeah. Okay, look, thanks very much, Matt, and thanks for that nice introduction. It's a pity I couldn't be with you in person, a meeting as a group somewhere nice in the US. As you can see, the sun is shining outside the window here in Ireland, but we've been getting a lot of rain. But there's no big surprise in that. But look, yeah, I just wanted to cover, first of all, really to talk about the work that we've been doing with BIF around building an international wiki on data collection and genetic evaluations. And in doing that, I'll also cover in terms of some of the work that we're doing in ICBF in that regard. And in terms of the broad overview of the talk, to give the listeners and viewers here, a wee bit of background in terms of ICAR and Interbeef, who are they? But then really to get into the detail and in terms of the work around the international wiki. Why did we do it? How did we do it? The challenge and opportunities identified and the next steps. And then maybe to finish off by looking at some of those future opportunities around international collaboration from an Irish perspective. First of all, maybe a wee bit about ICAR, the International Committee for Animal Recording. I'm sure lots of the people here this evening would have, or today would have heard of ICAR. What is it? It's a grouping of 117 members. It was set up in the, I think it was 1951, as 117 members across 59 different countries. And the goal of ICAR is really around profitability and sustainability of farm animals. And it does this through effectively 3 activities. The first and main one is really around guidelines and standards for animal recording. A second one then is, and we're going to talk a lot about that this evening. The second one then is really around the whole area of certification of equipment and processes. So for example, whether it's tags or milk meters or weigh cells, they've come through a process or a certification process through ICAR. So that's one of the activities. And then the third activity is really around the whole aspect of bringing the members together, the people together through knowledge exchange. And that network really is a big part of the ICAR activity. As I said, it's really around those 3 core areas: networking, guidelines, and certification. Interbeef then are a subgroup within a working group within ICAR. So ICAR is structured into 4 permanent subcommittees. They were established really in the early days around, for example, identification tags, etc. But then, as the activities of ICAR became more, more involved, more specific, more and more of these working groups were established. One of which is Interbeef. And I chair the Interbeef working group. We divide our responsibilities into a sort of an operational aspect and a technical aspect, which is chaired by Roman Santillon from France. And, we meet as a group bi-monthly by Zoom and twice a year, usually, but certainly an annual meeting where everyone comes together. And the event next year is in Toledo, Spain, for those that might like a trip to Europe at some stage. But of course, we also have meetings. We had our most recent meeting in Montreal in Canada. In terms of Interbeef within that, what is the activity of Interbeef? It's really around more accurate national and international evaluations of beef cattle. Interbull, a lot of people would have heard, that's the dairy equivalent. The big difference with Interbeef is we share phenotypes. We share phenotypes and pedigree and genotypes. For those of the viewers here this evening or today that are familiar with Interbull, they take sire proofs and do an international evaluation of the sire proofs. In Interbeef, we take the countries, and the members are sharing their phenotypes. So they have their own national evaluations, but then they share those the phenotypes from the national evaluations into a central database at the Interbull Center in Uppsala in Sweden. And from there, we offer services around international evaluations of that data. And that's really all with the objective of having more accurate international, but also national evaluations, as we can integrate that data from those 12 populations, so what's across 5 breeds and 2 great trait groups, about 45 million phenotypes, into our national evaluations. And, that gives you a sense of the countries there down the side, the French, UK, Ireland, Italy, Germany, Denmark, Finland, Sweden, Australia are involved. So, and the traits then that we're currently evaluating, and we're also now doing work on carcass traits, female fertility, and we have a project around single-step genomic evaluations. And of course, one of the projects is one that we're going to talk about here today, which is around the new wiki-based guidelines. So on the guidelines, with 12 working groups and 4 permanent subcommittees, and I said at the start, guidelines, a big part of the activities, they have largely, they've been a developing set of guidelines within each of those groups. And effectively, they are the living being or the living entity of each of those groups in terms of the activities around whether it's AI or beef recording or genotyping or milk recording or what genetic evaluations. So each of these groups then have a set of guidelines, and heretofore anyway, they've been, largely they've been in hard copy format and then accessible online on the ICAR website. And of course, any person can then go in and pick up the relevant guidelines for whatever it is, relevant traits or groups of animals or whatever. And I suppose that's where the opportunity in terms of the collaboration with BIF really kicked in. Certainly, look, I've been fortunate enough to attend a number of BIF conferences at this stage. And, if I go back to the one in Denver, I certainly recall at that stage you were kicking off this conversation around transitioning your guidelines to a wiki-based format. And, having seen the benefits of that subsequently, it was certainly a discussion that people within ICAR, within the ICAR board, and could see a real need and an opportunity to start to transition the ICAR guidelines across to a wiki-based format. And it was really initiated through Dr. Brian Wickham, who would have been a previous chair of Interbull, Interbeef, and also a vice president of ICAR. I worked in Ireland for a long time, New Zealander by background. Some of the people here might know him. So he was certainly very keen that, was this a project that ICAR and BIF could work collaboratively on? And a group of like-minded people got together on a few Zoom calls to see if this was a possibility. And of course it was, and we got the backings of the relevant boards, ICAR board, the Interbeef working group, and the BIF board. And the approach that we took was, was to effectively take a sandbox off the BIF wiki, so to effectively clear it down and in the sense of to use that infrastructure that was there, but then to start to build on that from in terms of the additional information that was going to come across potentially from those ICAR guidelines. And to do that exercise of transitioning across, there was a voluntary team put together of people from the ICAR side and from also the BIF side, and they were allocated specific trait areas. So for example, we broke it out into the carcass traits, the growth traits, the health traits, the management traits, and the reproduction traits. And in fairness, I know both Darrh and Matt and myself and others then were involved in that voluntary piece of activity. And look, the goal then was to look to continue that process of bringing across the new traits from the ICAR guidelines and to look at those new traits in the context of the existing BIF traits, and really to identify those commonalities and also potentially the trait differences or the differences between whether it's the trait definitions or how the data was recorded or evaluated or whatever. And of course, in doing that exercise, a number of key outcomes, both challenges and opportunities, were identified from that initial pilot project. So this is what the initial, the joint BIF and ICAR set of guidelines, as we developed it through into that sandbox looked like, and then the list of traits. And within this, there are examples of new traits that we were adding to the existing list of BIF traits or sets of traits. For example, some of those traits around, the functionality type of traits and the structural traits, some of the sustainability types of traits. And that certainly had the exercise, and I'm just taking the old, what you might see in terms of the BIF guidelines, just to give you a sense of that. These are the BIF guidelines and the sets of traits there, and you can already start to see that there's some new trait groups getting added here, which are effectively new traits that are being covered through the ICAR guidelines, which are not necessarily currently being covered in the BIF guidelines. So straight away, you're starting to see some of the benefits of potentially some new traits of interest in the future that are certainly of interest to ICAR members and could be of interest to US breeders and US farmers in the future. And one of the challenges that we did find, which was, it's always good to, there's opportunities, there's also challenges, but, if we take a trait such as, around calving ease, which is, and there's two ways to look at this trait. There's a calving ease trait, but there's the flip side of it, which is a calving difficulty trait. And, generally speaking, in one sense, you have a calving difficulty, which is expressing the in terms of ease of calving, in terms of going from very easy calving to considerably difficult, or even or veterinary assistance. And that's one way to look at the definition of the trait. And of course, the other way to look at the definition of the trait, which is the BEEF approach, which is, to look at it from a calving ease perspective. So one being, very much interpreting it that we're trying to promote calving ease here, whereas perhaps the ICAR, or maybe the European perspective on this, is more one to trying to avoid calving difficulty. So again, it's a good example of philosophical differences between how different countries and breeders and breeds view two traits, which are effectively the same, but they're just the flip side of each other. So that was just one example of and look, we identified other, if we talk about the challenges and the opportunities identified, whether it's the differences in the traits, talked a wee bit about the philosophical differences. And these are a couple of them, the maintaining the identity. This was two additional ones that we saw as very important for potential collaboration going forward. They need to maintain the identity of both organizations, but also in doing that to understand then ultimately the benefits of the collaboration. So touching on each of those, and I've mentioned the calving ease one there in terms of the differences in the traits. Another one is other score in BEEF. I know you can score others on a 1 to 5 basis, whereas in ICAR it's a 1 to 9. And where we got to in these differences in the traits was that perhaps one good way going forward would be that, if you're coming at this from a BEEF perspective, you're looking at the BEEF wiki page. But if you're interested in seeing, well, how does ICAR actually look at that, or the ICAR member countries, you have the opportunity to toggle through in terms of how ICAR and those member countries define that trait and present that trait, etc. So, again, just a practical way of trying to address some of the challenges that we would identify. On the philosophical differences, I mean, this one it's a bit more interesting in the sense that, within ICAR, and this is a positive, it's also a negative. The ICAR approach has been historically more focused around standards for recording. And in that sense, an expectation of exactness. So this is more around, for example, if you're putting technicians in the field to record a piece of data, well, how should you record a 200-day wait or a 400-day wait? Or how should you do a functionality scoring on an animal? So a lot more of the ICAR focus is around the guidelines are around that. They also tend to cover the ICAR guidelines and the needs of many stakeholders. So it's not just farmers, it's more also then breeders, breed associations, but it's also research organizations. And in that context, certainly the ICAR guidelines have, and we collectively identified this, forged more into, for example, those health disease trait, those health traits, the disease traits, the sustainability type of traits for the future. And one of the criticisms that I would have of the ICAR approach is, if you look at the ICAR guidelines, there's a plethora of guidelines. There's a guideline for almost everything. And the challenge in that is, well, if you're a farmer and, or if you're a person that just wants to zone in on the really important stuff, from an economical perspective, there isn't really that prioritization. Everything gets a place within the guidelines. And I think that's certainly something, as we did the piece of work with BEEF, we could see very real opportunities around that area. I mean, on the BEEF side, the approach is more around looking at the traits in terms of current economic importance and really encouraging then farmers to focus in on these traits. But in that sense, perhaps they're the guidelines, and far from me to criticise the BIF guidelines, but I think Matt and Darrh and other maybe made the comment that perhaps, not looking at the here and now in terms of the traits, and maybe not as much in terms of the traits that are going to hit breeders and farmers in the US in maybe the next 5, 8, 10 years. So that's certainly one of the benefits of the collaboration. And of course, that's what we then ended up trying to do, to integrate those different philosophies into a sort of a collaborative set of guidelines that could, where members on the ICAR side and on the BIF side could get the benefits of both. But important to obviously do that in the context of the identity of both organizations, because, both organizations are separate and will remain separate. There's no suggestion here other than that, because it's really just about the guidelines and how we work collaboratively together in terms of those guidelines. And we believe there are ways we can do that technically. I'm going to touch on those in terms of maybe how we might approach building the guidelines in the future in a wiki-based format, but certainly then in that context, having shared formats and structures are going to help a lot. Toggle options, sharing platforms, etc., would certainly enhance that opportunity to share and collaborate in a seamless way that respects the identity of both organizations. Because there's lots of benefits to collaboration, and I'm not going to dwell too much on this because Darrh's going to cover it quite extensively. The one that I want to really talk about, is where we're at from an Ireland and an ICBF standpoint in terms of how we see the benefits of collaboration. And for us, it's really ultimately about genetics and genetic improvement. And of course, the guidelines then are a very important first step in that. So maybe just to talk a wee bit about ICBF, Irish Cattle Breeding Federation. We're a cooperative made up of farmers, AI companies, stud books and recording organisations based in Ireland. Many of you will have visited Ireland, I'm sure, at different times. We're based down in Cork. And all of the relevant cattle breeding data is then shared in one database for a farmer and for industry benefits. So all of the stud book data, the performance recording data, the genotypes, 2 million genotypes, probably the largest beef genomics. We have the largest beef genomics project in the world, so all of that is shared. And we do enjoy good government support, good industry stakeholders support. All of the carcass data, information from marts, etc., is all shared in that central database. And it's done because, ultimately, ICBF's job is to align the industry around genetic gain and genetic gain driven off science and validated, science-based outcomes. And that's sometimes quite unpopular. If we look at our big beef genomics scheme recently, it was quite unpopular when we made the changes to the index. You see here, this blue line, you can see that no different to any other beef cattle country in the world, we were focused on the growth traits, the terminal traits. Our cows were getting bigger with less milk and less fertility. And we said, well, we have to do something about this. It caused a huge amount of uproar, is the word that's used here. But we were confident based on the science that, look, we start to put the economic emphasis on these cow traits, milk, fertility, cow size, that, we'll move our industry in the right direction. And that index, coupled with genomics, has really resulted in this replacement index turning around. We've took a wee bit of the accelerator off the terminal index, but that's not no harm. And we're very confident if we look at the sort of performance of the higher merit commercial beef cows, in terms of the replacement index, if you look at the phenotypes, what's it telling us? They're slightly lighter, 650 kilos, slightly higher calves, heavier calves, better weanling efficiency, better fertility, more calves per cow per year, more profit, and a lower carbon footprint. So it gives us confidence we're moving in the right direction. And from an ICBF standpoint, what we're focused on now is, well, how can we move faster? And that's where international collaboration becomes really important. Because the focus now is very much towards, mentioned profitability. It's really around these sustainability traits, and particularly it's really greenhouse gas mitigation. Now, I know we could have a whole session on this alone, Matt, and maybe next year's Brown Bagger session, we might cover it. But, the reality is in Ireland, and we can debate up or down as to whether this is right or wrong, but we live in Europe, and we all know that the European view with regard to greenhouse gases is, and we simply have to make a commitment to reduce them. And Ireland in that context we have a legal requirement now to, within our ag-food industry within Ireland, to reduce our greenhouse gas output by 25% by 2030. So this is a government requirement, legislated across all of the sectors, and ag-food has been hit with a 25% greenhouse gas mitigation reduction. Transport has to do it, energy has to do it, everybody has to do it, And that's then in line with what Ireland has pledged in terms of the overall EU, the Paris Accord, and all of that. And you could say Ireland's leading the way in that, and we could have that debate, but Ireland has made, as to whether it's right or wrong, but they made the decision that's what we're doing, because we export so much food into Europe. It's important to really set out our standard on this. So we're very engaged now in terms of how we breed animals that are going to finish earlier, have lower methane. We have lots of projects and initiatives around promoting further greenhouse gas mitigation. Importantly and crucially, we're going in the right direction. All the traits that are in the indexes at the moment, milk, fertility, a more efficient cow, a more efficient terminal animal, it's all taking us in the right direction, but we just need to focus in on those traits that are going to take us a bit further and a bit faster. And we've modeled it out that, we're going to contribute breeding about 20% of that 5.75 million ton target by 2035. So it's all very positive. And that's where the breeding program comes in, because ultimately it's data, it's genetic evaluations, but it's the breeding program that really drives genetic gain. I'm sure, Matt, you give that to your grad students whenever you're doing your lecture series. It's the breeding program. It's how quickly can you get the breeds moving aligned to the index. And in that sense, ICBF, we're progeny testing about 20-25 bulls per year. We put out the semen to about 400 commercial beef herds, and then we are taking in the calves and progeny testing them. And when I say progeny testing, we're collecting all of the data on farms, but then a group of the calves will come in for feed intake, feed efficiency, greenhouse gas, meat eating quality, the full gambit, and they'll come into our performance test data station there in Kildare, just outside Dublin. But what we're really interested in is also in the context of the breeding program, well, can we start to build links with other countries that potentially have high genetic merit bulls across these breeds for the indexes and traits that are relevant to Ireland? And of course, we know the answer is yes, but our challenge is identifying them. So we started about 3 or 4 years ago an engagement process, and these are the countries that we're currently engaged with. And you can see that at this point in time, we have semen from about 300 bulls across 8 breeds in 8 countries, all coming into our Gene Ireland breeding program. And, we've engaged with the US as well and have started that process in terms of potentially some bulls from breeds within the US. But it's all very, very positive, but it is very much driven off that requirement to, identify these really high genetic merit bulls, whether it's on our replacement index or additionally now it's on our dairy beef index for use on the dairy herd. And these are just an example of some of the, this is the program for the Angus bulls. There's also Irish bred bulls, but these are the Angus bulls that were on the program there in 21, 22. So all very, very positive. But again, I come back to the reason why we're doing that is really about generating genetic gain. outliers for the breeding program to find, those bulls that are really going to drop us in greenhouse gas or meat eating quality, the traits that are going to be increasingly important. But a precursor to that is, of course, the guidelines, and that's why we did the initial pilot project with BIF, and we were very happy with where it got to, and I know from a BIF perspective and reporting back to the boards, and that gave us the wherewithal to take the project on to another level. And starting now in autumn 2022, it's just kicked off, sorry, I should say September, just. So from a project perspective, within ICAR, we've taken on a couple of technical consultants, Rob Banks, an Australian, and then Bruce Golden, who many of you will know from the US. And they're going to help us now to move from the voluntary efforts. That'll continue, but we do need some targeted help. So Rob on the guidelines and Bruce on the infrastructure, with the goal of transitioning the full set of ICAR guidelines across into that wiki-based format by next spring. Now, that's going to be very important because having Rob and Bruce involved is that, one of the things we identified from the BEP pilot was the benefit of also having the ICAR guidelines on that with the same approach and infrastructure that have worked very well in the context of BIF. So that'll certainly, we believe, open up that opportunity for further future collaboration between ICAR, eBEEF and BIF, once we've completed out that exercise there next week. And obviously we'll be bringing it back to the relevant boards at that stage to more formally engage in that process. But certainly we're working towards that. But of course, it will require the formal support of both organizations. But everything is pointed to very positive in that because, the pilot project went well. And we certainly expect the next part of the engagement, more formal engagement, to work well as well. So look there in summary, the real mutual benefits for that collaboration between ICAR and BIF in the area of guidelines. We've completed that initial project, which has been very positive. It highlighted some challenges and opportunities, which we have now transitioned through to a new project. And certainly in that context, we'd hope to be back and re-engaging with BIF in 2023 to see how we would take the next more formal steps in terms of a shared set of guidelines for BIF and ICAR in the future. Because there's so much to be gained through international collaboration. We talked about the guidelines and methodologies, but of course the one that we're particularly interested in from an ICBF and also other eBEEF members, it's that exchange of genetic material that will really help us drive on genetic gain in our respective countries in the future. And look, all I can say finally then, Chairman, is to thank the opportunity to speak with the Brown Bagger series this evening, and also the opportunity to collaborate with BIF in this initiative. Because certainly from our side, we're always keen to engage with like-minded partners, and we're delighted to have that within the BIF group, and similarly, and look forward to further engagement in the future. So thank you.
All right, thank you, Andrew. I let me check the Q&A here. Oh, we have a question that asks what you're describe what you're doing on dairy on beef, or beef on dairy, I guess I should say.
Okay. So it's a very significant part of our beef industry now. Our dairy herd has grown significantly with the removal of quotas. Our beef herd has been declining. About 60% of the, it's growing, but it's about 50%, 7% of the beef generated in Ireland is now coming from the dairy herd. And a large part of that now is obviously beef sires being used on the dairy herd, primarily Angus and Hereford, but also Limousin, Belgian Blue, Charolais, the European breeds. We have an index, a dairy beef index. It's out in the public domain. It's done a very Chagas. We worked with that. It's peer reviewed. I think it's an animal science. Can certainly share that with the group afterwards. And there are the traits that drive, we'll call it, beef breeding decisions on the dairy herd. And it's, look, no big surprise. It's cost of calving and cost of gestation. But then you have the beef traits. Now, it's the beef traits then that are then very much like the terminal traits in the context of our suppler beef side. But about 70% of the weighting in the index is around the cost of calving and gestation traits, and then about 30% is on the beef traits, and that's based on the economics of dairy beef production or dairy beef breeding decisions. Crucially, what we're then doing is, and more rearers, calf rearers, want to know the beef merit of the calf that they're buying. So we have what's called a commercial beef value, which is effectively the dairy beef index, except you just knock off the calving piece, because the cost of calving is done, the calf is on the ground. So now you have effectively the terminal beef piece, which is now available as a commercial beef value on calves from the dairy herd. And that's pure dairy calves, but it would also be dairy beef or beef from dairy calves. It's also available on suckler bred animals or beef bred animals as well. And that has become a really important tool in terms of, from a farmer, from a rearer perspective, in terms of identifying the more profitable, sustainable animals from a rearing and finishing perspective.
Great, thank you. If you do have more questions for Andrew or for our subsequent speakers, please put them in the Q&A box. And we might, I think Andrew's going to stick around. We might go ahead and move on to Darrh. And Darrh Bullock probably doesn't need an introduction to this group, but I'll give one anyway. Dr. Darrh Bullock, a native of Florida, received a PhD at the University of Georgia, has been on faculty at the University of Kentucky. He can tell you how long, but long enough to have made substantial contributions to the utilization of genetic improvement programs and tools in the U.S. And this program is just one small bit of his entire extension portfolio. So really pleased to have him as a speaker today, answering the question, who cares what the rest of the world is doing? And Darrh says, indeed, he does. So Darrh, I'm going to turn the remote control over.
All right. Thank you, Matt. I appreciate it. Let me see. It said you have given me control. So let's see. There we go. All right. Thank you very much, Matt. It is a pleasure to be here. It was kind of funny, Andrew talking about the ICAR, and I've had a long association now with ICAR, and it started off, now it's Interbeef, but it started off as what we called the Beef Working Group, and it's kind of funny. I was on the BIF board in 2000 at the convention, and a guy named Hans Schild from Germany was there, and he was the chair of that beef working group, and he proposed to the board that they send a representative to Pretoria that fall to attend that committee meeting, and I remember John Crouch nominated me, and they decided to send me. And so when I got back to the hotel room that night, I had to call my wife and said, "Where is Pretoria?" And found out that it was in South Africa. So it's been a great working relationship ever since then. I've really enjoyed working with that group. So going to talk about a little bit about some of the things that are going on internationally. And I think it's no surprise to anyone, and I'm sure this is more expansive, but some of the different organizations that are doing international genetic evaluations, certainly we are here in the U.S., in a lot of cases, that might be just the U.S. and Canada, but also we have some North America evaluations and some that involve all of the Americas. And then I think there are a few breeds that even go more on a global stance in terms of their genetic evaluations. as Andrew just spoke, the ICAR group through Interbeef, and I put Ireland in parentheses because ever since I've been involved, Ireland has been kind of the leader in that whole project and that whole push. And so I'm going to more specifically go through, because what's happening with their international genetic evaluation currently is certainly far more limited than what the guys there at Ireland are doing. And I have my backup. I'll be able to ask Andrew for any help with questions on that if you guys have any. And then Breed Plan out of Australia does a lot of the genetic evaluations at multiple destinations across the country, across the world. So in Ireland, some of the things that that I wanted to just point out that are somewhat different than what we might be used to. Of course, I'm not going to go over the Americas part, but one thing is that they have data that comes in from both the commercial sector as well as seed stock. And I think that's something that we are certainly very limited on here in the U.S. and really the potential for a lot more opportunities there, and I'll discuss some of that kind of at the end with some of my closing comments. Another aspect of their data collection is that they, for some of the traits, they do have recorders that actually come out. I know a lot of the linear traits that they measure, this involves actually a recorder coming out and taking those measurements. Some of the traits, they have multiple traits, and I'm going to go over some of those here in just a minute that are not available here in the U.S. And then they handle some of those traits differently, and I'm going to discuss that as well, how they kind of focus on at least how they report and how they utilize some of the traits that we have here, but they handle it a little differently. And then the indices, as I think that Andrew pointed out, they primarily have the two indices, and I take that back. They now have the third one, the beef dairy index that he talked about. But on the strictly beef side, they have both a terminal and that replacement index. So some of the novel traits that I was intrigued with, one is mortality, and this is anything that's either stillborn or it dies within the first 5 days. And so this is a trait that they now have an EBV on and is included in their indexes. Now, it's certainly a lowly heritable trait. But I think, as we all know, if you have a calf to die, the economic impact of that is fairly substantial. So there's certainly, it's a trait worth measuring and recording and particularly being a part of a selection index. Calving interval, and so this is trying to get a grasp on that reproductive aspect of it. And I think does a very nice job of it. Of course, the goal being trying to have our cattle calve within 365 days so that we don't push them further and further back into the calving season. Again, a lowly heritable trait, but they reported that there is a lot of genetic diversity there, so there's actually able to make some progress even with that low heritability. Age at first calving, and this again is, I guess, somewhat of a measure of puberty and actually getting that female bred early on, which we all think has some certainly a lot of potential. Once again, that first calf heifer having the most difficult time to get rebred of any of the females in the herd. So if we can get them to calve at an earlier age, then it certainly gives her a head start for the future. Structure, and these are those linear measurements I was speaking of. They have some of the same ones that we do in terms of the udder scores and also the angles, but they go a lot deeper. They take actual muscle scores and multiple measurements. And as I mentioned earlier, this is where their recorders come in, and the recorder helps out and collects a lot of this data just to keep it consistent and things like that. And even though I don't think that in the U.S. we're ever going to see something, a system to where we do have the recorders and things like this, but I think we can still learn some things. Something maybe as simple as just taken a general structure score that producers could view and learn to do, just like we do body condition score or other things. I don't think it would be out of the realm to try and implement something like that that could be still farmer recorded here in the U.S. Here's where it got a little interesting as well. They're also creating some EBVs on some of the health traits, like they are doing TB, tuberculosis resistance, and you know, that might not be the top of the priority here in the U.S., but we certainly have some health type traits that we could certainly do a much better job with in terms of our genetic evaluations and trying to make some our cattle maybe to some degree more resistance to some of the issues that we face, and also on the parasite side of things. Their big pest is the liver fluke, and so they actually have an EBV on the liver fluke resistance as well. Again, it at least shows promise that there's opportunities for us here in the U.S. for some of these health type traits too, because of everything. That's the one that we really, to a large extent, have nothing on. We have some on the reproduction side. To me, that's more limited than we should be, but we really need to step up, I think, on that health side of things. Some of the traits that they handle differently. They certainly have a docility trait, but they collect it at two different points. They do both calves, and as I recall, and Andrew can correct me, that this is done by the recorders, and it's done similar to we do a shoot score, but they also have a value for cows, and particularly at calving, and how aggressive they might be. And so they treat it basically as the same trait, but they use it differently in the different indexes that they have, and give those two different weightings, which makes a lot of sense to me. It's really that docility, it's fine tuning it and how it's used within their selection indices. Cow weight, again, they have actually two different measurements here. They do it for both a live cow weight and then the cull cow weight. And the cull cow weight, that is basically the carcass weight of that cull cow at the plant, whereas the live cow weight is going to be more of that maintenance measure. So that's how they're getting at the maintenance side of it. Whereas the cull cow weight, now they're focusing in on, okay, that is a revenue source. And particularly when you're talking about developing a selection index, how we do it and how we tend to handle it now is you're trying to balance those two with the economic value that you put on cow weight, since we pretty much just do the mature cow weight. Whereas they're able to break it down independently and put the price for each of those independently. And once again, kind of a fine tuning of that selection index. Calving difficulty, this was the one that I found very interesting as well. They do it on both heifers and cows, whereas in the U.S. we strictly do calving ease based on calving difficulty of heifers. But they do it on both heifers and cows, and they also break it out into beef and dairy. And this is where it gets kind of interesting. This is how that kind of breaks out, and what I have in the column, of course, is the heritabilities, but what's really interesting are the genetic correlations. And as you can see, for their beef heifer and beef cow genetic correlation, that's at a 0.94. And that's fantastic. That tells us that, I think, how we're doing it here in the U.S. with just the heifer one, and we say that that can relate onto the cow. That's just evidence that that should be the case. That's basically the same trait. And if you do the same thing with the on the dairy side of things, the dairy cow, this is this 0.91, the dairy cow with the dairy heifer genetic correlation, once again, a very high correlation. But where we have to start looking and being a little concerned is with the beef heifer to the dairy heifer genetic correlation. Now we're looking at a genetic correlation of an only 0.8. And when you look at the dairy cow versus beef cow, we're all the way down to a 0.59. Now we're talking about different traits. And so the way we would do things, basically we're going to miss the boat, because this can, with genetic correlations that low, we're talking about some significant probably re-rankings, whether you were trying to apply that to a beef animal versus a dairy animal. And so I found this this table to be very fascinating, and I think very useful information that we can maybe get some ideas from for the future with our genetic evaluations, and particularly how those values can then be used in these selection indexes. I think it would be very, very useful. In Australia, switching gears a little bit, the breed plan is basically their genetic evaluation system. They also have breed object, which is basically what they've been using for indices. And I can tell you that they were an early adopter for this. I was in graduate school with a good friend of mine, Dr. David Johnston, and he's with AgBoo now. And I remember back when we were in graduate school, which was many, many moons ago, they were already had this implemented, and so it's been around for a long time. Ours are relatively new here in the U.S. And then they also have gone more recently into a more precision mating tool called Mate Select or Mate Cell that many of you have probably heard about. I know that Alison Van Eenenam has worked with Dr. Brian Kinghorn in trying to get that introduced a little more here in the U.S. The uptake hasn't been as great as probably we would have liked. So breed plan, some novel traits that they look at is days to calving. Now this is not the same as that Irish one that we spoke about with the days to first calving. This is more the theirs that would be similar to calving interval, and so it's just trying to get a measure of how long it is between each of the calves that the cows have. They also do one on a male trait, percent normal sperm. Shear force. Now we talk a lot about this in the U.S., but to my knowledge, I don't think we have any of our breeds that actually do a shear force EPD on. And then they also take the marbling. They don't not only have a marbling score, but they also look at the fineness of the marbling within there. And that has to do with within their system, and they're reaching into the Japanese market. And that's a much greater concern, that trait within that marketing system. And so they utilize that there. And then they also have structural soundness, and they put some emphasis in terms of genetic evaluations on the structural soundness as well. I'm not going to go into this, but just wanted to point out back to what ICAR and particularly in eBEEF, but really this was an ICAR effort that Andrew pointed me towards, and they have put together a task force trying to look at futuristically, what are some of the things that we need to be thinking about and be concerned about? And I kind of summarized it a little bit. I went through the slides that they had put together, and the one big takeaway that I got was that sustainability is dependent on efficiency. And Andrew mentioned that. Now he was talking about they're going a lot further on that, but it is some of those things that we already do, but need to improve on, like herd efficiency. And that's our reproduction and health traits. The more cattle we can produce and keep within the system and actually market and get the beef from, that makes us more efficient. And so that's not a waste of greenhouse gases going into production that never ends up with an end product or a marketable product. And so I think we need to work more towards trying to make more improvements on that reproduction and health standpoint. And then the production efficiencies, which I think we do a great job with, that's our feed conversions and things like length of production. The faster gains we get on them, the shorter they are in the system, and so therefore the less they're contributing to some of those greenhouse gases. So some closing thoughts, and so we can get moved on and hear about BIF. I think there's some opportunities to learn through what others are doing. I just gave you a few examples, and I encourage you just to look around. I get lazy just like everybody else, and don't kind of see what's happening in other places, but there is a lot to learn. The biggest thing I would say is that incorporating commercial data, we have really got to get moving and move the ball on that, I think, at some point in time. and maybe even rethink how we handle some of the traits, particularly that I think an eye opener was that beef and dairy point that I brought up. Some industry and government support is critical, I think, to these future traits. And the world, I think, has done a much better job than us on this. Their industries have really stepped up, and actually financially, the entire industry, the entire beef industry, commercial, seed stock, everybody supports that genetic evaluation and understands the benefit of it. And even a lot of those across the world, their governments have stepped in to really support it. From the U.S. perspective, we really get very limited industry funding. Our checkoff is evolved around the end product and a lot more on the promotion, as opposed to those dollars going into genetic evaluations where we could really improve things. Very limited targeted government, very limited funding, and when we get it from the government, it's usually targeted to what they feel are the traits that need to be followed up on. And we appreciate it, but it would be nice to have a little more flexibility there. And bottom line is, this puts an extreme burden on the seed stock industry. Those guys are the ones that really have to handle the burden of supporting the whole thing for the rest of the industry. And I wish we could come up with a mechanism where we could spread that out. I know BIF has put some efforts into it. There were some efforts back when the NBCC, the full board was together, but we just haven't made a lot of progress there. And with that, Matt, I will turn it back to you, and happy to answer any questions if there are any.
Okay, thanks, Darrh. Sorry, I struggled to get unmuted there. But I've noticed we have a few questions here in the Q&A box, so we might see there. Question, how will migration to wiki influence accessibility and implementation to performance testing? Darrh, you might handle that.
Well, I guess from in terms of, I don't think it's going to affect performance testing in my mind at all. For one thing, we are keeping this completely, I guess, autonomous within each of the organizations. So we're certainly, the way BIF is going to handle it, it is not going to go to more of the ICAR approach, which is standards and requirements, I think, Andrew. They tend to do that. And it came from the milk influence, that with the milk testing and things like that. But I think also there are a lot more standardization to their testing programs as well. And so I don't really see it affecting performance testing at all. In the US, that's going to still be done primarily on the farm with the farmer accessible records and things like that for the most part. I don't know if that answers correctly, Matt, but if not, just shoot me a line and we'll hit it again.
All right, thanks. And we've got another question here, if I can see it again. It had to do with mature weight. Let me try.
I can see it. I'll read it.
Okay, yeah.
I'm going to throw it to Andrew. It's in Ireland for the cow weight measurement. At what point in the annual production year or at what times are the cow weights collected?
So we introduced a program there a couple of years ago, a beef environmental efficiency program, which encouraged farmers to weigh their cows and calves, commercial beef farmers and obviously pedigree, but to weigh their cows and calves. We got a fantastic response to it. And I know while some people might say, well, it wasn't nice that there was some government money potentially for that. But the reality of it is, rather than potentially put people on farms to collect this data, it was really cost to cover the action associated with, weighing, having weigh scales and bringing the cows in and weighing the cows and calves. And we got about, of the 900,000 beef cows in Ireland, about 550,000 of those are Cows are being weighed on an annual basis now. Cows and calves are being weighed on an annual basis. And the farmers are typically weighing them, at around 5-6 months of, if you talk about it in the context of the calf, so our seasonal system in Ireland means cows are calving in February, March, April sort of time, and then are weaned in sort of October, November time. So this is now becoming just an activity that beef farmers in Ireland then are doing, with their cows in that sort of summer period, cows and calves in that summer period, and it gives us a good handle on milk, but also on growth and weanling efficiency and those sorts of key sustainability metrics.
And maybe one last question before we move on. Have there been attempts to have beef genetic evaluations become integrated with USDA AGIL? I don't know, Darrh, do you want to?
Yep. The answer is yes, but as you can see, it really wasn't USDA, but it was when the NBC consortium was functioning in full force and getting some federal funding and all. That was an attempt to be made at that time, was to develop a funding source that would come from the industry that would have a centralized genetic evaluation here in the U.S., which is primarily how most all other countries have done it. But when the federal funding source went away, what it did do was it kind of ended our traditional way of doing it, which genetic evaluations at various universities. To all of those genetic evaluations have now moved in-house at the breed associations and are still supported through research and all at the various universities as well as USDA. But I don't suspect we're ever going to get to a centralized genetic evaluation system in the U.S. through USDA or any other source would be my guess.
Okay, thank you, Darrh. I tend to agree. So one final speaker for today, Kajal Devani from Canadian Angus. And for those unfamiliar, Canadian Angus would be both red and black. Kajal has the task of being the chair of the local host committee for the 2023 Beef Improvement Federation Annual Symposium. And that's a heavy lift, I know, but her and her team of volunteers have a unique experience planned for attendees in 2023. Kajal, if you can unmute yourself.
See, Matt, I'm not sure if she can. She's not on the panelist group with us, and I'm not sure.
Can you
don't
switch?
know.
Can
I don't know if I can.
over?
You might be able to, but I don't know. I'm looking. Boy, where's Bob when you need him?
I'll get there. Kajal.
I did see her on there. She is, but I don't know how we get to her. There she came. Oh, good.
Hello, folks. Thank you for figuring out the technical mysteries.
Okay, Kajal, I'll move your slides for you.
Super. Thanks, Matt. Thank you for inviting me to participate in the Brown Bagger. I've had the pleasure to now sit into several of the presentations, and they've all been good. So I've gotten to learn a lot as well. But it's fantastic to be able to round off this conversation with an invitation to BIF 2023, which will be held in Calgary, Alberta. The theme will be precision breeding, so hopefully again lends to the conversation from Darrh and Andrew as to how can we make things better. I probably should have gone first in retrospect, because I have a few slides just to give all the participants here some background on BIF, but Andrew and Darrh may have covered everything, or you may have caught yourself up on it if you didn't have the background on BIF. Basically, a centralized place to really make recommendations for the industry to standardize what we're collecting and then advise us on how to use, how to appropriately use the data that we're collecting. So the BIF has an annual symposium, and it moves around typically. We haven't had the opportunity to host in 12 years now, but we're really excited to be able to offer this invitation to all participants to come to Calgary and experience BIF in a very Canadian way. So the dates are July 3rd to 6th, and that's just before the Calgary Stampede, which is a world-renowned event, one not to be missed, which will go from the 7th onwards. It's a 10-day event, so we hope people will stay and participate in Stampede as well. You're able to book your rooms and access all the agenda information off of the eBEEF.org website. As we get things finalized, the website will get updated. Like I mentioned, the program is based on a theme of precision breeding, and we will focus on tools, technology, and methods towards this. We'll be able to explore how producers can maximize the genetic gains towards their goals from all this data that Andrew and Darrh have been talking about this past hour. We'll start off at the Platform Innovation Center, which is a new building that we've just had developed in Calgary. And really the building and the theme of the symposium and the Young Producers event that will start the symposium off is innovation and investment into innovation. We'll have a panel of producers that have adopted innovation onto their operations to talk about how easy it is or how difficult it is on a first-hand basis. We'll discuss, how you can promote or drive innovation through diversity, and then also how you can access innovation through mentorship. Subsequently, we have, I'm just highlighting a few of the speakers and presentations that will lend to this theme, including, Peter Amer from Abacus Bio in New Zealand, Christine Bays from the University of Guelph in Canada, Brian Kinghorn, who I believe Darrh, referenced the Mate Select system, who developed that. And as we move through the agenda, I have a few more highlights on the next slide. You'll see that it's really an extension of the conversation that we've had this past hour on things like how can we leverage tools and technology to incorporate that commercial data. For example, Darrh talked a lot about recorders or certified scorers available through the Interval or InterBEEF system. Well, in Canada, we're working on adding AI technology to our cameras so that they can, we can score linear or subjective phenotypes using AI technology. There will be a presentation on high immune response genetic evaluations in Angus. So, kind of a similar on that trait or trail of discussion on the TB resistance. So we're going to have some really great breakout sessions and general sessions as well. The agenda includes a tour of Olds College, which has a smart farm technology showcase, a new meat processing facility and meat lab, as well as a microbrewery. For all those who don't know, Canadians are quite famous for their hospitality. Excuse me. We'll round off the event with a tour on Thursday, which will include some feed yards, seed stock producers, the University of Calgary Ranch, and perhaps a sneak peek of the Calgary Stampede. One thing I will remind you folks is you will need a passport to come to Canada, which is different from the last time that we hosted the event. So if you want to get your passports ready and your reservations, your hotel reservations booked, I would encourage you to do so early. And again, just to invite you all to come and participate in the next BIF Symposium, which will be in Calgary, Alberta, on July 3rd to 6th, 2003. Oh, sorry, 2023.
Thank you, Kajal. I know that Darrh and I most certainly will be there. I just booked lodging today. So echo your comments on the need to do that sooner rather than later. And we're certainly looking forward to what you and all the other folks up there involved in planning this conference have in store for us. So thank you very much. And more broadly, thank you to all the participants for this year's Brown Bagger seminar series. You will receive an evaluation survey. So if you registered for this, then you'll get a survey. Please give us your thoughts on this year's program and certainly suggestions for programs next year. And also those recordings of this year's session will be available at nbcec.org. So with that, again, I thank you for your engagement today, and for those that watched previous sessions, thank you for that as well, and look forward to seeing your comments in the survey that you'll receive.